He was easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. Not because he was forgettable, but because he never asked the room to bend around him. He didn't compete for airtime or punctuate his ideas with performance. When others spoke, he listened like it mattered. When meetings ended, he packed up quietly and left before the posturing began. People mistook that for shyness, or weakness, or a lack of ambition. They were wrong. He noticed everything. He noticed when someone took credit for work that wasn't theirs and never corrected it out loud, just adjusted the next deliverable so the truth surfaced on its own. He noticed which metrics were inflated, which questions were deflections, which silences were intentional. He noticed people in the margins, including me. I realized it in small ways: the timing of his replies, the way his eyes lifted when I spoke, not lingering but present. Once, during a meeting, I hesitated over a word and he nodded, just once, almost imperceptibly, like permission to continue. It steadied me more than it should have. He avoided happy hours the way some people avoid mirrors, left before jokes turned sharp, before alcohol loosened what professionalism kept caged. He took the stairs instead of the elevator, ate lunch at odd hours. If there was a spotlight, he stepped just outside its reach. It made him safer and lonelier. I told myself my interest was admiration, that wanting to understand him didn't mean wanting to possess him, that watching the way he navigated the office with quiet restraint was just respect. But admiration can still cross lines when it forgets the other person has a say. I knew he carried something heavy, not trauma exactly, something more practiced. The kind of carefulness that comes from learning early which parts of yourself are safest to keep folded away. He didn't flinch often, but when he did, it was controlled, managed, as if he'd rehearsed the reaction in advance. What I didn't realize then was that restraint can be a form of strength, that choosing not to take space doesn't mean you don't own it. One afternoon, as we passed in the hallway, our reflections overlapped in the glass. For a second, our eyes met, not directly, but through that warped, doubled image. He didn't look surprised. He looked aware, like someone who had been paying attention for a long time. I told myself it meant nothing, a coincidence, projection, my guilt making meaning where there was none, but something in my chest tightened all the same. I thought I was invisible to him. I wasn't. The night it crossed from noticing into something else didn't feel dramatic while it was happening. There was no alarm, no internal voice shouting stop, just a quiet deviation from routine that slid into place like it had always been there. He had stepped away for coffee. I knew because his chair was still warm when I passed. His jacket hung on the back, untouched, like a promise he'd be right back. The screen in front of him glowed softly, unlocked, waiting. I slowed, then stopped. I told myself I was doing him a favor. Anyone could walk by. Anyone could see sensitive information. I reached for the mouse with the intention of locking it. That's when the video filled the screen. Two men in a small kitchen. Morning light through a window I didn't recognize. One of them said something that made the other laugh, head tipping back, unguarded. Their hands brushed, not accidentally, not boldly, just enough to say this was familiar, chosen, safe. I froze. There was nothing to look away from except my own reaction. No scandal, no shame on the screen, just intimacy so ordinary it felt invasive to witness without being invited. My first feeling wasn't jealousy or judgment. It was something worse, an ache of recognition paired with immediate guilt. I had learned something true about him, something fragile, and I hadn't earned it. I locked the screen. The click sounded louder than it should have in the empty office. I walked away, heart thudding, telling myself it was over, that the moment would dissolve if I didn't give it weight. But moments don't dissolve when you replay them, they sharpen. After that, I started seeing him differently, not as a collection of behaviors, but as a person carrying a private life I now knew existed. Every choice he made felt newly deliberate. Every silence felt fuller. When he smiled politely at a joke that wasn't funny, I wondered who he laughed with when he didn't have to perform. I told myself this made me more empathetic. It didn't. It made me attentive in ways that edged too close to entitlement. I began tracking patterns: when he stayed late, when he left early, when his playlists shifted moods. I noticed which coworkers he trusted with small talk and which he kept at a careful distance. I noticed where he positioned himself in meetings, always near an exit, always angled slightly away. The worst part was how quickly it all felt reasonable. Each observation came with an excuse. I care. I'm just trying to understand. It helps me be kinder. The language of compassion covered the mechanics of intrusion so neatly I almost believed it. But the truth was simpler and uglier. Watching felt safer than asking. As long as I stayed silent, I couldn't be rejected. As long as I observed from a distance, I could imagine connection without risking it, power without exposure, knowledge without consent, and fear dressed up as patience. There were moments I caught myself mid-glance and felt the heat of shame rise in my throat. Moments I almost chose differently, almost looked away, almost. What kept me there wasn't desire. It was the terror of losing the version of him I'd built in my head, the one who never had the chance to say no. I told myself it didn't change how I felt about him, but I stopped looking away. I didn't see him approach. I felt the air change first. There are people who announce themselves with noise, and then there are people who don't need to. He belonged to the second kind, polished without being warm, casual without being careless. The kind of confidence that comes from knowing most rooms are already tilted in your favor. He stepped into the space beside the elevators as if it had been waiting for him, smiled like we were sharing a joke that hadn't been told out loud. "You've been spending a lot of time near his desk," he said, conversational. Not a question, not an accusation, just a fact, delivered gently enough to sound like concern. My stomach dropped before my mind caught up. I said something forgettable, a shrug, a half laugh, the kind of response people use when they think minimizing will make them disappear. He didn't react to it at all. He just leaned back slightly, giving me space I hadn't asked for. "I notice patterns," he went on. "It's kind of my job." That's when I understood the danger. Not because he knew, but because of how easily he admitted it. As if watching people was expected. As if privacy was a courtesy, not a right. He mentioned details he shouldn't have known. Times, angles, reflections. Things that only made sense if you imagined the building's eyes seeing more than we pretended they did. He didn't say the word security, but he didn't need to. He let the implication settle between us, heavy and precise. Then he said something that tightened the room around my chest. "HR already has a note," he said lightly. "Nothing official yet, just a concern. The kind that turns into something if it needs to." My pulse roared in my ears. Concern was the most dangerous word in that building. It didn't accuse, it invited escalation. He talked about professionalism, about optics, about how misunderstandings could hurt people who didn't know how to protect themselves. He framed it as guidance, as mentorship, as if he were offering me a way out. All I had to do was cooperate, feed him information, stay quiet when certain projects shifted, look the other way when pressure was applied. Nothing illegal, nothing obvious, just alignment. The way he spoke about him made my skin crawl, not with overt hatred, but with a kind of dismissive amusement. Softness to him was a liability. Privacy was a flaw. Anyone who didn't perform strength loudly enough deserved to be managed. When he smiled again, it wasn't friendly this time. "You're not the only one who's been watching," he said. That was the moment the story broke open. This wasn't about attraction anymore. It was about survival. I walked away from that conversation feeling smaller than I had in years, not just afraid of what he could do, but ashamed of how easily I'd been cornered, how my silence had made room for someone else's control, how watching without being seen had taught me exactly nothing about power. If you're listening to this and something in your chest feels tight right now, pause with me for a second. Comment below. Have you ever taken someone for granted? What happened when you realized it? Because here's the truth I didn't want to face yet. People like him don't invent leverage. They find it. They wait for the moment someone convinces themselves they're harmless, and then they decide how much that harmlessness will cost. I thought I was afraid of being exposed. I hadn't even considered what it meant to be used. He confronted me before I could decide who I was going to be. No warning, no audience, just the two of us, late again. The office thinned down to its skeleton crew and the low hum of machines that didn't care about intent. I was packing up, rehearsing excuses I hoped I wouldn't need, when his voice reached me from behind. Steady, quiet, impossible to mistake. "Can we talk?" There was no edge to it, no accusation. That somehow made it worse. We sat across from each other at a small conference table, glass walls on all sides, reflections layered over reflections. If anyone walked by, they would have seen two co-workers having a normal conversation. Nothing about it looked dangerous. Everything about it was. "I know," he said simply. My chest tightened. I opened my mouth, then closed it again. Apologies lined up in my throat, tripping over each other. I waited for anger, for humiliation, for the kind of disappointment that hardens into punishment. Instead, he looked tired, not wounded, not shocked, just someone who had been carrying the weight of other people's choices for a long time. "I saw you," he continued, "not just once." The words landed carefully, like he was setting something fragile down between us. I felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with consequences and everything to do with being known without having chosen it. "I'm sorry," I finally said. It sounded thin, inadequate, too late. He nodded once, not acceptance, not forgiveness, acknowledgement. Then he said the thing I wasn't prepared for. "He's been watching too, only louder." My head snapped up. He didn't look surprised by my reaction. If anything, he seemed to be measuring it. He told me everything calmly. Emails forwarded and archived, access logs that didn't match job descriptions, subtle threats wrapped in corporate language, timelines that showed patterns no one wanted to name out loud. He had been collecting it for months, not out of paranoia, out of preparation. "I didn't say anything because I needed proof," he said, "and I needed to know who else knew." I felt something twist in my stomach. Shame, yes, but also something colder. The realization that I hadn't been the only one observing. I'd just been the least careful. "You knew about me," I said. He didn't deny it. "I did," he replied, and I let it continue. The words stung, but there was no cruelty in them, just truth. "I needed to know why," he went on, "whether it was fear or entitlement or something else." He met my eyes then, really met them. No performance, no armor. "I needed to know who would choose fear," he said softly, "and who would choose truth." The room felt suddenly smaller, not because of him, but because of myself, because I understood in that moment that he had never been as vulnerable as I'd assumed. Quiet isn't the same as powerless. Restraint isn't the absence of strategy. He had been watching the watchers and waiting. There was no promise in his expression, no reassurance that I could fix this with the right words, just an opening, narrow, exacting, honest. I could walk away, pretend this conversation never happened, protect myself the way I'd been taught, or I could step into the part of the story where silence stopped being an option. I wish I could tell you the choice felt brave. It didn't. It felt terrifying and irreversible. The truth didn't arrive like relief. It arrived like paperwork. Once we spoke, really spoke, there was no dramatic pause before consequences. There was a process, forms, calendar invites titled in neutral language, conversations that started with disclaimers and ended with warnings disguised as concern. The building that had always watched quietly turned its attention inward. HR didn't raise its voice either. They asked questions the way surgeons ask about pain, precise, repetitive, impossible to evade without revealing something worse. Dates, times, interactions, who said what, and who was present when it happened. I watched the story flatten into bullet points and felt something inside me resist the reduction, as if turning fear into documentation made it less real. It didn't. Word spread faster than facts ever do. Glances lingered. Conversations paused when I entered rooms. Invitations dried up without explanation. People who once laughed with me now nodded politely and kept their distance. Like association itself carried risk. I had become expensive. He paid too, just differently. Projects stalled without reason. Meetings he once anchored quietly moved forward without him. Opportunities evaporated in the space between "we'll follow up" and silence. No one accused him of anything. That was the cruelty of it. The system didn't need to punish him openly. It just needed to stop seeing him. There were days I questioned everything, nights when I lay awake, wondering if I had mistaken courage for recklessness, if keeping my head down would have spared us both this slow erosion, if silence would have hurt less than watching the truth make us smaller before it made us safe. Because fear doesn't vanish when you confront it. It adapts. He never complained, never framed himself as a victim. That restraint somehow made it harder to bear. I caught myself wanting him to be angry. At me, at them, at the system, just so the weight of it all could shift somewhere else. But he stayed steady, documenting, responding, showing up to every meeting with the same calm he'd always carried, as if he understood something I was still learning. That endurance isn't passive, it's active restraint in the face of pressure. The breaking point came quietly. A conversation that ended with, "We appreciate your cooperation," and meant the opposite. A door that closed a little too softly. An email that never arrived. I sat alone in a conference room long after the lights dimmed, staring at my reflection in the glass, and wondered who I would have been if I'd chosen differently, if I'd never looked, if I'd never known, if I'd stayed safe. There were nights I wondered if silence would have hurt less. But even in the worst moments, when doubt pressed hardest, there was one thing I couldn't unlearn. Being watched had hurt him, but being invisible had hurt more. And once you see that clearly, going back isn't an option, even when the cost is higher than you expected. In the end, nothing exploded. No applause, no apology tour, just absence. One morning, his badge didn't work. The door stayed closed. Security stood where power used to be. By noon, his calendar invites vanished. By evening, his name no longer pulled results. The office adjusted the way it always did, quietly, efficiently, without ceremony. Fear doesn't mourn its own. What stayed was the damage, the distance, the knowledge that doing the right thing doesn't rewind time or restore innocence. It only stops the bleeding from spreading. He asked me once, weeks later, if I understood the difference now between being watched and being seen. I didn't answer right away because the truth was uncomfortable. I had confused proximity with permission, observation with care, silence with safety. Getting caught didn't ruin my life, it revealed it. If this story unsettled you, good, it should. Because most harm doesn't start with cruelty, it starts with justification. And most power doesn't announce itself, it waits for you to look away. So ask yourself this, honestly. If you were given the choice between comfort and courage, which one would you recognize fast enough to choose? Sometimes the moment you're exposed isn't the end of the story. It's the moment hiding finally stops.